After years as a U.S. Marine, all he wanted was silence and a place far from everything he couldn't forget. So when he found a sealed mountain workshop in Gray Ridge selling for just $99, he didn't ask too many questions. But the first night he stepped inside, his K9 stopped cold, staring into the darkness. Someone was already there, a young woman, hiding, waiting, terrified. What she told him would drag him into a buried truth of smuggling, betrayal, and a murder that was never meant to be uncovered. And now, the people behind it were coming back. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. A cutting winter wind swept across Gray Ridge, pushing fine snow along the silent mountain road and rattling loose metal in the distance. Mason Reed sat in his truck a moment longer before stepping out, letting the cold air hit his face like a reminder that he was no longer where he used to be. No longer surrounded by noise, commands, or the constant pressure of men depending on him. Gray Ridge, Colorado was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. A town tucked deep in the mountains where people learned to mind their own business because asking questions often led to answers they didn't want. That was exactly why Mason had come here. Not because he believed in fresh starts, but because distance was the closest thing he trusted to one. Staff Sergeant Mason Reed was 41 years old, tall and broad-shouldered with a lean, hardened build shaped by years in the United States Marine Corps. His movements controlled and economical, never wasting energy on anything unnecessary. His face carried sharp, defined angles, a strong jaw lined with rough stubble, a faint scar beneath his right eye that pulled slightly when he was tired, and eyes the color of cold steel that rarely rested on anything without assessing it first. His dark hair was cut short out of habit more than discipline now, with streaks of gray beginning to show at the temples, and there was a quiet heaviness in the way he carried himself, not weakness, but the kind of weight that came from surviving things most people never had to think about. Leaving the Marines hadn't given him peace. It had only taken away structure, and without that structure, his thoughts had too much room to move, circling memories he couldn't shut off, moments that came back sharper in silence than they ever had in chaos. The passenger door opened, and Ranger stepped down into the snow beside him, landing lightly despite his size. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, muscular and well-trained, his amber-toned fur thick against the cold, with a black saddle marking across his back that gave him a sharp, commanding appearance even at rest. One ear carried a small notch from an old training injury, and his eyes were alert, intelligent, always working, always reading the environment before reacting. Ranger had served as a military K9, trained in detection and tactical support, and like Mason, he hadn't left that life behind so much as carried it with him. He didn't bark without reason, didn't move without purpose, and when he became still, it meant something mattered. Mason pushed open the rusted gate, the chain already cut earlier that day when the county finalized the transfer, the metal scraping softly as it moved. $99. That was all it had taken. Not because the land was worthless, but because no one wanted the responsibility attached to it. The words of Leonard Briggs, the county clerk, still lingered in his mind, the man's tired voice flat and detached as he explained the terms. A thin, pale man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair and nicotine-stained fingers, the kind of man who had processed too many bad properties to care anymore. This wasn't a sale, he had said. It was a release. Mason would take everything: legal risk, structural damage, environmental concerns, and whatever had happened here that the paperwork didn't fully explain. The explosion, the dead owner, the unanswered questions. Mason had signed anyway, because none of that mattered as much as getting away. The workshop stood ahead, a long, low structure of steel and concrete, its surface worn and scarred by time, the roofline slightly warped from past damage. The door creaked when Mason pushed it open, the sound echoing faintly inside, followed by the stale, heavy air that carried the scent of oil, rust, dust, and something burned long ago that hadn't completely faded. He stepped inside, boots pressing against the cold concrete, his flashlight cutting through the dim interior to reveal machines left exactly where they had last been used, tools scattered across workbenches, cables hanging loose, everything frozen mid-motion as if time had stopped instead of moved on. It didn't feel abandoned, it felt interrupted. Ranger moved ahead of him, slow and controlled, then suddenly stopped. Not a bark, not a growl, just stillness. His body tightened, ears forward, eyes fixed toward the far end of the workshop where a small office stood behind cracked glass panels, its door slightly open. Mason noticed immediately, he always did. That kind of reaction wasn't curiosity, it was recognition. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Ranger didn't answer, but he didn't need to. He took one step forward and stopped again, his attention locked onto the office. Mason moved slowly, his body shifting into a state he hadn't fully left behind, senses sharpening, instincts taking over without permission. He swept the light across the room, over the desk, the scattered papers, the overturned chair. Then something moved, small, fast, but enough. Mason stopped instantly. "I'm not here to hurt you." Silence filled the space between those words. Then, slowly, a figure rose from behind the desk. A young woman. She stood carefully, as if her body had been locked in one position for too long, her movements cautious but controlled. She looked around 24, slender but not fragile, her posture tense yet steady. Her long chestnut brown hair fell loosely around her shoulders, slightly tangled, her skin pale from cold and exhaustion with faint freckles across her nose. Her green eyes were sharp, alert despite the fatigue, watching Mason not with panic, but with careful judgment, as if she was deciding whether he was safer than whatever she had been hiding from. She wore a worn denim jacket over a gray hoodie, both marked by dirt and wear, her jeans scuffed at the knees, her boots carrying the signs of days spent moving without rest. There was a slight tremor in her hand, but the rest of her held firm. "You're not with them, are you?" Her voice was rough but steady. "No," Mason said. A pause stretched between them. "My name is Hannah. Hannah Whitaker." The name hit him immediately. Whitaker. The report. The man who died here. "You're his daughter," Mason said. She nodded. "You own this place now?" "Yeah." Hannah glanced briefly toward the dark entrance behind him, then back again, something tightening in her expression. "My father didn't die in an accident," she said quietly. Mason didn't interrupt. "They killed him." Ranger stood up at the exact same moment, his head snapping toward the darkness behind Mason, body tense again. Hannah's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're coming back." And in that moment, Mason understood, this wasn't a place to start over. It was something he had just walked into. The wind pressed harder against the workshop walls, carrying a low metallic hum through the structure as if something outside was testing its weakness. Mason didn't move right away after Hannah's warning, but his body had already shifted into readiness, every sense tightening, every sound filtering differently now, not as background noise but as potential signal, and beside him Ranger stood perfectly still, his posture aligned toward the entrance as though he could feel movement long before it became visible. Mason exhaled slowly, forcing his thoughts into order, because panic solved nothing and assumptions got people killed. And when he looked back at Hannah, he saw the difference between fear and certainty in her expression. The way her eyes didn't dart or search, but stayed fixed, as if she wasn't guessing. They were coming, and she knew it. "How long have you been here?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice steady, giving her something to hold on to that wasn't fear. "A few days," she answered, her voice still controlled but thinner now, as if the strain was catching up with her. "I came back to find something my dad left, but they were already watching the place." Mason studied her more closely, seeing now what exhaustion had been hiding. Her movements weren't just tired, they were calculated, conserving energy, every step deliberate like someone who had been forced to think before moving for too long. "You said they killed him," Mason said, shifting slightly so he could keep both her and the entrance in view. "You sure about that?" Hannah nodded once, her jaw tightening. My dad knew something was wrong weeks before it happened, she said, her eyes lowering briefly as if replaying something she hadn't wanted to remember. He kept telling me the numbers didn't match, shipments going out that weren't logged right, parts showing up that no one ordered. He thought it was just bad accounting at first. She paused, swallowing, then looked back at Mason. It wasn't. Who? Mason asked. Vernon Pike, she said, and this time there was no hesitation, only a hard edge beneath the fear. He was my dad's partner, mid-40s, always clean-cut, always smiling like he knew something you didn't, wore press shirts even in a place like this. People trusted him because he looked like he had everything under control. Her expression darkened slightly. But my dad said he was too smooth, too careful, like he was always thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Mason didn't respond immediately, but he stored the name, the description, the pattern. Men like that didn't get caught easily, and when they did, it was usually because someone forced them into a mistake. So your dad found out he was running something out of here, Mason said. Hannah nodded again. A transfer point, she said. Industrial equipment, stolen, rerouted, cleaned through fake records. This place was perfect for it. Remote, quiet, no one paying attention. She took a breath, steadying herself. When my dad realized what was happening, he didn't go to the police right away. He wanted proof. Mason's eyes shifted briefly across the workshop, taking in the layout again with a different understanding now, not as abandoned space, but as something that had once been used with purpose. So where is it? He asked. Hannah hesitated, then looked toward the center of the floor, not the office, not the walls, but the concrete itself. He hid it, she said, not in the office, not anywhere obvious. Mason followed her gaze, and Ranger moved at the same time, stepping forward with sudden intent, nose lowering toward the ground. The dog began to circle slowly, not randomly, but in tight, controlled movements, stopping every few steps to test the air, then shifting direction slightly as if narrowing something down. Mason watched without interrupting because Ranger wasn't guessing, he was tracking. "What are you looking for?" Mason asked quietly. "There's a maintenance access point under the floor," Hannah said. "Old piping system. My dad showed it to me once when I was a kid, said it was the only part of the shop he trusted more than his office, because no one ever thought to look there." Ranger stopped, completely. He lowered his nose to a specific section of concrete near an old welding table, then pawed once, lightly, then again, more insistently. Mason moved closer, crouching down, running his gloved hand over the surface until he felt it, a slight difference in texture, a seam too clean to be natural wear. "This it?" he asked. Hannah stepped closer, her breathing shallow now. "Yeah," she said, "that's it." Mason stood, scanning quickly for tools, then grabbed a rusted pry bar leaning against the wall, testing its weight before wedging it into the seam. The metal groaned as he applied pressure, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the empty space, and for a second he hesitated, aware that noise like that traveled, that if someone was already nearby, they would hear it. But hesitation meant nothing now. He pushed harder. The panel lifted. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying a different smell, cleaner, sharper, untouched by the surface dust. Mason set the panel aside, revealing a narrow compartment beneath, just large enough to hold a small storage box. Hannah dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling slightly now as she reached inside and pulled it out, a metal container sealed tight against moisture. For a second she just held it, staring, as if everything that had led her here was sitting in her hands. "Open it," Mason said quietly. She nodded, fingers working the latch with more care than speed, until finally it clicked. Inside were items wrapped in cloth and plastic, organized, deliberate, not thrown together. Mason leaned in slightly as Hannah pulled them out one by one. A worn notebook filled with handwritten entries, pages marked and folded. A small USB drive, sealed in a plastic sleeve. A compact GPS unit, older model but still functional. And finally, a small handheld voice recorder. Hannah picked it up last. "This is it," she said, her voice barely steady. Mason gestured toward it. "Play it." She hesitated, then pressed the button. Static filled the space for a second, then a man's voice, older, calm, familiar. "This is Elias Whitaker, recording this in case something happens." Hannah's breath caught slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "I'm meeting Vernon tonight," the voice continued. "He thinks I don't have enough to prove anything, but I've seen the records, I've tracked the shipments, and I know what he's been running out of my shop." Mason felt his jaw tighten slightly, not from surprise, but from confirmation. "If this goes wrong," Elias's voice said, quieter now, "then it wasn't an accident." The recording ended. Silence returned, heavier this time. Hannah stared at the device in her hand, her expression caught between grief and something harder, something colder. "He knew," she whispered. Mason didn't respond right away. He was listening, not to the recorder, to something else. Ranger's head lifted sharply, his body went rigid. Then, a faint sound from outside, boots, on gravel, more than one. Mason reached for the light, killing it instantly, plunging the workshop into darkness. Hannah's breathing quickened. "They found me," she whispered. Mason's voice stayed low, controlled. "Stay down." Ranger moved closer to him, silent, waiting. Outside, a voice carried faintly through the wind. "They're in there." Mason's eyes adjusted to the dark, every instinct snapping fully into place now. This wasn't over, it had just begun. The wind howled through the workshop's broken seams as Ranger's body went rigid again, his head snapping toward the entrance a fraction of a second before the sound reached Mason's ears. Boots grinding against frozen gravel outside in a rhythm that wasn't searching but closing in. And Mason didn't waste time thinking about whether they had been followed, because the answer was already there in the way Ranger stood, silent and locked in. The kind of stillness that only came when something real had crossed into their space. Mason's breathing slowed instead of quickened, his posture lowering slightly as he shifted his weight, his mind breaking the workshop into sections, angles, blind spots, elevation points, because he didn't need to fight two men at once. He needed to turn them into two separate problems. And beside him, Hannah stayed where he had placed her back near the cold metal wall, her chest rising and falling too fast but controlled. Fear sharpened into awareness instead of panic, her green eyes fixed on him as if waiting for instruction more than rescue. The door dragged open with a long metallic scrape, letting in cold air and two figures that moved with purpose rather than hesitation. The first man stepping in slow and heavy, easily over 6 feet tall, thick through the chest and shoulders with the dense build of someone used to hard labor rather than training, his movements grounded, economical, his face partly shadowed by a dark knit cap, but revealing a rough, uneven beard and a jagged scar cutting from the edge of his mouth toward his chin. The kind of mark that suggested he had been close enough to violence to remember it. While the second man followed with a different energy entirely, lean and restless, his frame lighter but quicker, his blonde hair cropped tight at the sides, his sharp features tense, his eyes moving too fast, sweeping the room in quick, aggressive motions that betrayed impatience and a lack of discipline. "She's here," the younger one muttered, his voice tight, and the older man answered quietly, "Then we finish it." And that was enough for Mason to understand this wasn't random. They hadn't wandered in, they had tracked Hannah, and they hadn't come to talk. Mason moved without signaling it, shifting laterally through the workshop instead of retreating, using the heavy machinery as cover, his boots placed with controlled pressure to avoid loose debris, every step measured, his body staying low and aligned with the structure. And Hannah followed along the wall exactly as instructed, her movements quieter than he expected for someone exhausted, while Ranger slipped ahead into shadow, disappearing between metal frames and abandoned equipment, not drawing attention yet, just repositioning. The younger guard noticed movement first, his flashlight snapping toward the shift of shadow. "Something moved," he said, stepping forward, and the older one didn't rush, just angled right, his path slower, more deliberate, and Mason felt the timing open exactly the way he needed, because separation had begun before either man realized it. He guided Hannah into a narrow metal corridor formed by stacked shelving and a broken conveyor system, a confined passage where only one person could move at a time, then shifted position just out of sight, waiting, listening, letting the younger man come to him instead of forcing contact, because forcing contact created chaos, and chaos created mistakes. The younger guard stepped in fast, light raised, breath shallow, and he didn't see Mason until it was already over, because Mason didn't strike with force. He controlled with precision, one arm locking across the man's upper body while the other drove his wrist down, cutting off leverage, redirecting the light, collapsing balance in one continuous motion that left no space for resistance to build. And within seconds, the struggle broke apart into silence, the man dropping to his knees, breath gone, control gone. "Don't make a sound," Mason said, his voice low, flat, not threatening but final, and the man froze immediately, fear replacing whatever intent he had carried in, while Ranger stepped in beside them, silent but close enough that the presence alone pinned the man in place. Mason studied him quickly, mid-20s, narrow face, shallow breath control, reactive rather than trained, and asked, "Name?" "Luke," he said quickly. "Luke Mercer." "Why are you here, Luke?" "We were told to watch the place," Luke answered, his voice uneven, his eyes flicking toward the corridor entrance as if expecting the other man to appear at any second. "Watch it for what?" "For her," Luke admitted, glancing toward Hannah before dropping his gaze again, and Mason felt the confirmation settle, not as surprise but as structure, the pieces aligning into something solid. "Who gave the order?" "Vernon Pike," Luke said immediately, faster now, like holding back wasn't worth it anymore. Mason leaned slightly closer, his tone unchanged. "What is this place really?" Luke hesitated, then shook his head slightly. "It's not just a shop," he said, voice lower. "It's part of a route. Equipment moves through here, stolen stuff, heavy industrial parts, cleaned through paperwork before it goes out again." "And Elias Whitaker found out," Mason said. Luke nodded. "And that's why he's dead." Luke didn't answer, but the silence said enough. "And now?" Luke swallowed hard, his voice tightening. "Now Vernon's clearing everything, records, people, anything that can point back to him," he said, his eyes flicking again toward Hannah. He said, "No loose ends." Behind them, the second man's footsteps grew closer, slower now, more careful, his voice cutting through the metal space. "Luke?" And this time it carried suspicion, not certainty, and Ranger's ears shifted instantly, his body tightening, ready, while Mason adjusted his grip on Luke just enough to reposition, not releasing him, just shifting control, his mind already calculating the next move, the angles of approach, the distance between structures, the broken stairwell leading upward, the overhead platform that could split line of sight completely. He didn't rush, he moved. Pulling Luke with him just enough to keep him quiet, Mason shifted deeper into the structure, using the vertical layout now instead of the floor, guiding Hannah toward the base of a broken stairwell that led to the upper catwalk, its metal steps partially collapsed, but still usable if you knew where to place your weight. And Hannah followed without question, her movements slower but precise, her fear no longer scattered but focused, while Ranger moved ahead, taking position above, watching both directions at once. The second guard reached the corridor entrance too late, his flashlight cutting through empty space where Luke should have been, his posture tightening as he stepped forward, scanning faster now, the confidence gone, replaced by something sharper, more dangerous, and Mason didn't engage, didn't reveal himself, because control meant choosing when the situation became direct, not reacting when the enemy expected it. Below the metal platform, Luke's breathing shook slightly, but he stayed silent. Whether from fear or instinct, Mason didn't care, because the information he needed was already clear, the pattern set, the outcome inevitable. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This wasn't a question of what had happened. This was a system that had killed once and was preparing to erase everything that remained. And now Mason knew exactly what he was standing in. A cold dawn crept over Gray Ridge, the storm thinning into a gray sky that made everything look stripped of warmth and excuses. Mason hadn't slept, not because he couldn't, but because sleep required a level of detachment he didn't allow himself when the situation was still moving. And as he sat at the old metal workbench inside the workshop with Ranger lying alert at his feet and Hannah across from him, arms folded tight against her chest, the evidence they had pulled from beneath the floor no longer felt like fragments, it felt like direction. The USB drive lay beside the worn notebook, the GPS unit still blinking faintly as if it had never stopped tracking, and Mason's eyes moved between them with the same quiet intensity he used to reserve for mission briefings. Because once something crossed the line from suspicion into structure, he knew exactly what to do with it. Hannah looked different in daylight, the exhaustion still there but less hollow, her features sharper now that fear had a shape, her long chestnut hair tied loosely back, her green eyes clearer, steadier, and there was something else in them now, not just survival, but expectation, as if she had finally reached the point where truth mattered more than fear. "I tried going to the police," she said, her voice steady but edged with something that hadn't been there the night before, something closer to frustration than fear, and Mason didn't look up immediately, letting her continue because tone told him as much as words. "They didn't even write it down properly," she said, her jaw tightening slightly. "Just nodded, told me they'd look into it, and then nothing, like it didn't matter." Mason finally lifted his gaze. "Who did you talk to?" "Deputy Harlan Reeves," she said, and there was a clear shift in her expression when she said the name. Not fear, not respect, just disappointment sharpened into certainty. "He's been here for years. Tall, broad, always smiling like he's listening, but he never actually hears anything he doesn't want to." She exhaled slowly. "My dad didn't trust him either." Mason nodded once, not surprised, because small towns had patterns, and power didn't always wear a uniform you could see clearly. "Connections?" he asked. Hannah nodded. "Vernon knows people," she said. "Not loud about it, but enough that things don't get investigated too closely." That was enough. Mason didn't argue, didn't suggest going back, because he had seen too many systems fail quietly to believe in them by default. Instead, he turned the USB drive over in his hand, then reached for his phone, his thumb hovering for only a second before dialing a number he hadn't used in over a year. Ranger lifted his head slightly, sensing the shift in Mason's focus, while Hannah watched in silence, her attention fixed on him now instead of the past. The call connected after 2 rings. "Mason Reed?" he said simply. "I need someone who still cares about doing this right." There was a pause on the other end, then a woman's voice answered, calm, measured, and direct. "You only call when it matters," she said. "What did you find?" Her name was Nora Delgado, a state-level investigator with a reputation that didn't come from rank but from results. A woman in her late 30s with a compact, athletic build, sharp brown eyes that missed very little, and dark hair usually pulled into a tight, practical bun that kept it out of her way when she worked. She had spent years in forensic investigation before moving into field operations, and unlike most, she didn't rely on assumptions, she relied on patterns, which made her difficult to mislead and even harder to pressure. Mason had worked with her once, years ago, and she was one of the few people he trusted to follow a case without bending under outside influence. "I've got transaction logs, GPS routing, and a recorded statement from the victim before he died," Mason said. "And it all points to a man named Vernon Pike running an illegal transport network through a condemned industrial site." Nora didn't respond immediately, but Mason could almost hear her thinking. "Send everything," she said finally, "and don't touch anything else until I see it." Mason glanced at the GPS unit, then back at the notebook. "Too late for that," he said quietly. The line went silent for a second, then Nora exhaled. "Then don't make it worse," she replied. "I'm on my way." Mason ended the call and turned the laptop toward Hannah, plugging in the USB drive as the screen flickered to life. Files populated quickly, Logs, timestamps, shipment routes, coded entries that mapped movement across multiple states, and even without full context, the pattern was obvious, consistent, structured, not random or opportunistic, but organized with long-term precision. "This isn't small," Mason said quietly. "It's a system." Hannah leaned closer, her eyes scanning the data, her breathing steady now, no longer reacting but processing. "He knew," she said softly. "Yeah," Mason replied, "and that's why he didn't walk away." By midday, Nora arrived, her vehicle cutting through the gravel road with controlled speed, and when she stepped out, she looked exactly as Mason remembered, focused, composed, her posture upright but not rigid, her eyes already scanning the environment before she even reached the door. She didn't waste time on greetings, just stepped inside, took in the workshop, the layout, the evidence, and then moved directly to the laptop, her expression tightening slightly as she reviewed the files. "This is bigger than a local operation," she said after a few minutes, her voice calm but firm. "Money flow alone tells me that." Mason nodded. "There's more," he said, handing her the notebook and recorder. Nora reviewed everything quickly but thoroughly, her movements efficient, her focus absolute. And when she finished, she stood, her eyes shifting toward the far end of the workshop where the explosion had occurred. "Show me the site," she said. They moved together, Mason leading, Hannah close behind, Ranger pacing silently at Mason's side, and when they reached the damaged section of the workshop, Nora crouched near the base of the structure, her gloved hand running along a section of exposed piping. She didn't speak immediately, just observed, traced the line, then pointed to a section that had been slightly altered. "This wasn't a rupture," she said. "This was opened." Mason watched closely. "Manually?" She nodded. "Pressure doesn't fail like this," she said. "Not clean. Someone adjusted it." Hannah's breath caught slightly behind them, but she didn't interrupt. Nora stood, her gaze shifting toward the entrance. "And the door?" she asked. Mason walked over, testing the lock mechanism, then nodded. "It locks from the outside," he said. Nora's expression hardened slightly. "So he couldn't get out," she said. Silence followed, heavier now, because speculation had just become structure. Back inside, Nora replayed the final audio recording, her expression unchanged as Elias's voice filled the space again. But this time, when the threat was spoken, when Vernon's name carried weight, she didn't pause it. She let it play through to the end. When it stopped, she looked at Mason. "That's not circumstantial," she said. "That's intent." Mason nodded once. Hannah stood still, her hands clenched slightly at her sides, but her eyes were steady now. Everything was aligning. The money, the roots, the threat, the method. This wasn't a mystery anymore, it was a case. And every piece was finally falling into place. A deep winter silence settled over Grey Ridge, the kind that made every distant sound travel farther than it should, and every shadow feel heavier than it looked. Mason had already chosen his position before full dark took hold, not because he expected a fight, but because he understood patterns, and men like Vernon Pike did not leave loose ends behind when something went wrong, especially not after one of their own failed to return. And that alone was enough to guarantee Vernon would come back, not cautiously, not to investigate, but to erase anything that could be traced back to him. Mason didn't build traps or rely on anything unpredictable. He simply controlled the space. The main entrance left unchanged so nothing would signal interference. The side access partially blocked to limit movement. The upper catwalk giving him a clear line of sight while keeping his presence concealed. And below him, Ranger moved silently through the workshop floor, his amber-toned fur blending into shadow, his posture low, his breathing controlled, tracking scent and motion in a way no human could replicate. While Hannah remained positioned against the reinforced section of the wall near the office, out of direct sight from the entrance, her body tense but steady, no longer the person hiding in fear, but someone who had chosen to stay despite knowing what might come. Vernon arrived just past full dark, his vehicle cutting its engine before reaching the workshop, the approach deliberate, controlled, and when he stepped out, he carried the same composed presence Hannah had described, A man in his mid-40s with a clean-cut appearance that contrasted sharply with the environment he operated in. His dark hair neatly kept, his face clean-shaven, his posture upright without stiffness. And there was something in the way he moved that spoke of long practice in staying calm under pressure. Not the kind of calm that came from discipline, but the kind built from always needing to stay ahead of consequences. Behind him were two men, both heavier, less refined. One with a thick beard and wide shoulders, the other slightly younger, but still built for force rather than thought. Their movements slower, waiting for direction rather than creating it. And Mason recognized immediately that they were not decision-makers, they were execution. Vernon stepped inside without announcing himself, his eyes moving across the workshop once, not searching wildly, but reading absence, the lack of normal patterns, the disruption of something that had been under control for too long. And that was when Ranger stopped moving completely, his head lifting slightly, body tightening, the signal so subtle most would have missed it, but Mason read it instantly, adjusting his stance, his breathing steady, his focus narrowing onto Vernon alone. Because in a situation like this, control did not come from eliminating threats, it came from fixing the center. "You came back," Mason said from above, his voice calm, carrying just enough to reach without revealing more than necessary. And Vernon stopped, not startled, not rushed, just enough to acknowledge the presence before slowly turning his head, his expression settling into something unreadable for a second before forming into recognition, not of the man, but of the situation. "So you're the one who interfered," Vernon replied, his tone even, measured, as if this were a conversation he had anticipated rather than stumbled into. And Mason didn't move from his position, keeping elevation, keeping control of the space without escalating it. "You lost someone," Mason said, not as a question but as a fact, and Vernon's eyes shifted slightly, a small pause that confirmed more than words would have, before he exhaled once, adjusting his stance, recalculating. "That usually means something changed," Vernon said quietly. "It did," Mason replied. Vernon stepped further inside, slower now, his attention more focused, his men shifting slightly behind him, waiting for instruction that didn't come immediately, because Vernon wasn't the kind of man who reacted first, he analyzed first. And Mason could see it happening in real time, the processing, the shifting, the understanding that whatever had been hidden here was no longer secure. "You found something," Vernon said. Mason didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either, and that was enough. Vernon's expression tightened just slightly, not anger, not fear, but acceptance of a change in control. "Then we're past the part where this ends quietly," he said. Ranger moved then, just enough, stepping forward from the shadow into partial light, not attacking, not lunging, simply revealing presence, and both guards reacted immediately, their attention snapping toward the dog for a fraction of a second, their focus breaking just enough, and Mason used that moment not to strike but to shift position, closing distance carefully, forcing Vernon to hold where he stood, not giving him space to retreat or reposition without escalating the situation. And that control, that refusal to rush, was what held everything in balance. "You don't need to be part of this," Vernon said, his voice still controlled, still attempting leverage through conversation rather than force. "Walk away and none of this follows you." Mason's expression didn't change. "It already did," he said. For a brief second, Vernon's composure thinned, not breaking, just tightening, the realization settling that this was no longer something he could redirect, and that was when the sound came, distant at first, then growing, headlights cutting through the darkness outside, engines approaching in controlled formation, doors opening in sequence, voices carrying authority that didn't belong to the men inside the workshop. Vernon didn't turn immediately, but Mason saw it in his eyes, the moment understanding locked in place. "You made a call," Vernon said quietly. Mason didn't respond. He didn't need to. Boots entered the workshop in organized movement, weapons lowered but ready, presence controlled, and at the front of them stood Nora Delgado, her posture steady, her expression focused, her voice cutting clean through the space. "Vernon Pike," she said, "you are under arrest for premeditated murder, large-scale illegal trafficking, and destruction of evidence." This time, Vernon's composure shifted in a way it hadn't before, not collapsing, but tightening into something rigid, the understanding that control had left him completely, and for the first time that night, he didn't try to negotiate, didn't try to redirect, because men like him recognized when the structure they relied on had been broken. The restraints clicked into place, and the system he had built ended in silence. Morning came slowly, the cold still sharp, but the air different, lighter in a way that didn't erase what had happened, but made space for what remained. And inside the workshop, Hannah stood with the official documents in her hands, her name printed clearly as the rightful owner, her posture no longer defensive, no longer waiting, but steady, grounded in a way she hadn't been before. Even though nothing around her had changed, the machines still broken, the structure still worn, the weight of debt and repair still real. And yet the space itself no longer felt like something she had to escape from. Mason stood near the entrance, his bag packed, his posture unchanged, the same controlled readiness he had carried from the beginning, because leaving was what he understood, what he had always done, what had kept him moving forward even when nothing else made sense. And for a moment, he looked out at the snow-covered ground beyond the workshop, the quiet stretching outward in a way that no longer felt empty. Hannah looked at him. "You're leaving?" she asked. Mason paused, just slightly, his gaze shifting back toward the workshop, toward the structure that had been nothing more than a problem when he arrived, and something else now, something he hadn't expected to feel. "For now," he said, but the words didn't carry the same certainty they once would have, because for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like something he needed to run from, and that was enough to make him stay. Sometimes what looks like coincidence is something far greater. A place sold for almost nothing, a man searching for silence, a girl running from the truth, and a loyal dog who never left his side. None of it happened by accident. In ways we don't always understand, God places people exactly where they are needed most. We all face storms in our daily lives, fear, loss, pressure, and moments where everything feels uncertain. But just like in this story, God doesn't always remove the storm. Sometimes He sends strength, truth, and the right people to stand beside us through it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need hope today. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. I would truly love to hear your story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more stories of courage, redemption, and faith. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your path, and give you peace in every season of your life.